Hi, and welcome to this mini-series on the Yerushalmi, Palestinian Talmud. The Yerushalmi is a critical piece to understanding the whole body of rabbinic literature. But I'll begin by distinguishing two terms, thought and literature. Rabbinic thought was a whole world of teachings and ideas that was shared and developed over centuries by a whole community of scholars, often without discernible boundaries or divisions. But rabbinic literature is the material that was organized and transmitted in a set of discrete collections, each edited and finalized in a particular time and place, and each exhibiting unique character and style that distinguishes it from the other collections, even when there is some shared material. Each one also stands in a particular relationship to other collections, both those that preceded it and those that came after. We can roughly divide the Talmudic Rabbis into three groups. The Tanaim in Eretz Yisrael, from 70 through the completion of the Mishnah in 220 CE. The Amoraim of Eretz Yisrael, from 220 until sometime in the 5th century. And the Amoraim in Bavel, who also began after the Mishnah's completion, but continued their work through the end of the 6th century. The Tanaim produced two types of collections: law codes, the Mishnah and Tosefta, and books of Midrash, Midrash Halacha. Now, there are many connections and points of overlap between the legal texts and the Midrashic texts, but as edited works, they are sharply and consistently distinct. The Amoraim Eretz Israel produced and transmitted three types of collections: legal commentary on the Mishnah, the Talmud Yerushalmi, Midrash Agadah, which very different in style from the Tannaitic halachic midrashim. Midrash Agadah never addresses issues of halacha. It focuses on homiletics and morals and stories. And thirdly, liturgical texts. The classic early linguists and paitanim all lived in Eretz Yisrael in this period. These genres, like the Tannaitic genres, are also very distinct. Liturgy is its own world, which is why it's not on this little chart, with no clear relationship to other rabbinic collections at all. It's not even clear that all of the liturgical poets were fully rabbinic Jews in any obvious sense. The others, while they have some parallel passages, the Yerushalmi and Midrash collections are also sharply distinct in focus, style, and organization. And finally, the Amoraim in Bavel, by contrast, produced only one grand collection, the Bavli, into which they poured all of the various types of teachings and material they valued and wanted to preserve. Now, the Yerushalmi is the one text that is linked in fundamental ways to all of these other works. It's not just one of the collections of rabbinic literature. It is linked in essential ways to each of the other types. That's obvious with the Mishnah, on which the Yerushalmi is a running commentary and which is its constant focus. Also the Tosefta. The Yerushalmi often quotes or draws on Braitot from the Tosefta. They're even much more likely than their Bavli counterparts to understand the Tosefta Braitot clearly and fully, since they are much closer in time and geography to the creation of those texts. And the Yerushalmi also frequently, as part of explaining a Mishnah, quotes the Midrash underlying it, reintroducing the source material that, at least in some cases, the Mishnah itself intentionally left out. Now, if we then turn and look forward in time to the Bavli, it's not only the Yerushalmi is not only incidentally parallel to the Bavli. The two Talmuds are intertwined at their core, and I mean at their core. The Bavli exists, and in the form that it does, only because it was building on a basic structure that was crafted and laid out by the Amoraim of Eretz Yisrael in the Yerushalmi. We'll say more about each of these relationships, but for now I want to convey why it is so crucial to have a sense of just what the Yerushalmi is and how it works. You will encounter texts from it. Often people will quote rabbinic teachings, they'll have a source sheet on some topic, they'll say, here's a quote from the Bavli, this one's from the Yerushalmi, that one's from this kind of midrash. It makes a big difference what each of those different collections is and how that affects how we should read and make sense of a text taken from it. And these distinctions often escape the awareness of the people who are doing that quoting. Don't be that rabbi. Being aware of the structure and character of each of these collections can be a really important piece to making sense of those texts and what we can learn from them. Understanding the Yerushalmi is also crucial because the Yerushalmi is the long-neglected keystone of the rabbinic canon. Its connections to all those other texts are incredibly illuminating. Certainly for modern Talmud scholarship, a huge amount of what we are able to do in terms of reconstructing the evolution and the conceptual, the textual, the stylistic development of the Babylonian Talmud. How it came to be as a text and why it is structured the way it is. So much of the insight we were able to have about it is because we have the Yerushalmi to compare it to. Again, more on all of these things as we go. We're going to go through some of the basic history of what it is, the when and the who. We will look at some of its basic and most defining features, how it's structured and organized, and some of its characteristic style. We'll talk about how it is distinct from, but also related to, the Bavli. And we'll talk about what makes learning Yerushalmi so challenging, even, or perhaps especially for those with significant experience learning the Bavli. And we'll talk about how the Yerushalmi enables us to look at and approach problems in understanding the Bavli and the whole rabbinic tradition in new ways. Once we've done all that, we've seen a bit of what it is, how it's structured, how it's connected to the Bavli. We'll look together at a few examples of Yerushalmi texts that exhibit in obvious ways some of these features. To give you a feel for how the Yerushalmi reads differently than the Bavli, but also how, once you look past the surface, they are often closely parallel or intertwined. These happen to be examples that I am particularly attached to and have spent a lot of time on, because they are passages that allow us to see overtly some things about the Yerushalmi that are usually easy to miss, although they are usually present. And they are therefore texts that I have a lot to say about. We're going to look at a few examples of sugyot that illustrate and highlight both some of the general and key features of the Yerushalmi text, and some of the important ways that that we will have talked about how it's connected to the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Midrashim, and the Baba. Okay, that's our plan for this set of lectures. I want to know just one more thing. For the Yerushalmi, more than for any other major rabbinic collection, the issue of how it was transmitted over time, from the time of its completion at the end of the 4th century CE, essentially through the time when it was first printed in the early 1500s in Italy, is absolutely critical to understanding the text and how to decode it, and understanding how and why it was and was not used and studied by rabbis through the Middle Ages, and the place that it had in the traditional study of rabbinic literature. It's also important to make sense of many features of the text as we have it. And we say the text as we have it. That's an important kind of caveat. It means we have a text of the Yerushalmi. We know that there are major errors, omissions, differences between what we have and the text as it began, but we have no way to recover that original text. So all we can do is use what we have, do the best to make sense of it, and remember as we do so that we're trying to reconstruct an earlier version. We're not going to go into these issues of transmission, though, in too much detail, because my plan is to do a separate set of lectures specifically on issues of how books of oral Torah got written down, how they were transmitted through different eras and places. But we will spend some time specifically on the story of the Yerushalmi, both because you just can't talk about its use without understanding the issues of its transmission, and honestly, because it's just an astonishing and unbelievable story, but also to come. First, there you go, the name. This Talmud is referred to almost exclusively by late Gaonim and by Rishonim as the Yerushalmi or the Talmud Yerushalmi. Any reference you will come across in medieval texts calls it the Yerushalmi, and therefore, traditionally, it's always been known as that. Some of the earliest Gaonic texts refer to it by a couple of other names. The Talmud de Ma'arava, the Talmud of the Westerners, since from the perspective of Babylonia, Israel is to the west, or Talmud Shel Eretz Yisrael, the Talmud of the land of Israel. But those names go by the wayside and Yerushalmi is accepted. Among modern scholars, Yerushalmi seems like a problematic name because during this entire period, starting from the Emperor Hadrian's decree in I think 129 CE and the Bar Kokhba revolt, and throughout this period, Jews were prohibited from living in the city formerly and now once again known as Jerusalem. So therefore, while it was being written and developing, it was not in any part or sense composed in the city of Jerusalem. It was known by the name Yerushalmi because 500, 600 and more years later, Jerusalem had become the stand-in for all of the land of Israel, for people living very far away. In the same way that the term Zion, very clearly in the Bible, refers specifically to Har Zion, the mountain on which the temple was built, and perhaps the city of Jerusalem that also was built along on the sides of Har Zion. But over time, the yearning of Jews for Jerusalem is broadened to the yearning of Jews for Eretz Yisrael, and therefore Zion, and like Yerushalmi come to represent the whole, but technically inaccurate. That's why many scholars have taken to referring to this as the Palestinian Talmud. Palestina was the Roman name for the province of which this land that we call Israel was a part. Now, lots of people have qualms about referring to it as the Palestinian Talmud because the word Palestinian also, as you may or may not be aware, has other valences and is used in other contexts in the modern world. So people don't love that as a name for this classic rabbinic text. What we've basically been left with then is a kind of stalemate with two awkward options and nothing better. Today it's referred to in Hebrew always as the Yerushalmi. In English, it's occasionally the Jerusalem Talmud, but more often the Palestinian Talmud. You'll find that I myself, my tendency is that in talking about it, I'll call it the Yerushalmi. But if you see a reference on a source sheet to a Yerushalmi text, it will generally say PT for Palestinian Talmud and the name of the Masechta. So even I myself am eclectic about the name. Now, the Yerushalmi is a Talmud in the fundamental way that we are familiar with. It has mostly discussions of specific Mishnah texts, but also some material that is connected but digresses to related questions. It is built on the foundation of and closely and entirely follows the structure of the Mishnah. It is in the form of a running commentary on the Mishnah, even more than the Bavli, which shares the same basic structure. Now, there is Yerushalmi on only 4 of the 6 starim of Mishnah, the same as the Bavli, but not the same 4. The Bavli has Gemara on Moed, holidays, Nashim, marriage, Nezikin, civil and criminal law, and Kodashim, temple and sacrifices. The Yerushalmi does have Talmud on the first Seder, Zra'im, about agriculture. They were interested in these laws, even though most of them were not being practiced, because this whole area of law is about the sacredness of the actual physical land of Israel, something in which they were highly invested. For that same reason, the Babylonians were much less interested in the agricultural laws. On the other hand, the Yerushalmi does not have Talmud on Kodashim, which the Bavli does, and neither Talmud has Talmud on Taharot, purities other than Masechet Nida. Now, this does not mean that the Eretz Yisrael Amoraim were not interested in or did not ever study this material. They certainly did, but they didn't have enough material to bother collecting and compiling an organized Talmud on those 2 starim. On the other hand, there are also other sections of the Yerushalmi that are missing, where we would expect there to be material. Now, there were scholars who theorized that the Yerushalmi did originally have Talmud at least on Kodashim, if not Taharot, and that material was simply lost, but had at some point existed. It has now been definitively shown that that is not the case, that there never was a Yerushalmi on these 2 starim. By contrast, we also don't have Yerushalmi on, for instance, the final 4 chapters of Masechet Shabbat and the ends of Masechet Makot and Nida. Now, the realization that there never was Yerushalmi on Kodashim led some other scholars to posit that there also had never been Yerushalmi on those chapters in Shabbat, Makot, and Nida. But other evidence has since shown that there clearly was. It turns out that these missing chapters have a quite mundane and obvious, but also kind of mind-bending explanation. We're missing the end of Shabbat, which at 24 chapters is the longest single Masechta of Talmud, of Mishnah that has Talmud. The end of Makot, which is really a single unit with Masechet Sanhedrin. And together they comprise the second largest single unit of Talmud. And the end of Masechet Nida, which is the very end of the entire Talmud. These chapters, it turns out, were at some point each the last few pages, page or a few pages in a volume, and got torn off or otherwise destroyed over time, whether in being transported or being stored, whether it got torn off or simply rotted by damp conditions. And this is a totally reasonable and even likely scenario for any individual manuscript or copy of a text. These things happen over centuries, especially in the kinds of conditions that we're talking about. But in this case, the loss had to have happened very early in the Yerushalmi's transmission, since even Geniza fragments of the Yerushalmi are missing them, and those would have been copies made in the 9th to 10th centuries. And that tells us that even in its earliest period of transmission, the 9th, 10th centuries, the Yerushalmi existed in only a handful of copies anywhere, and was consulted rarely enough that this loss went unnoticed and then could not be restored. It's actually unbelievable that the Yerushalmi even survived, yet survive it did. Now, the Yerushalmi was redacted gradually. It was gathered and organized. Material was arranged and structured around Mishnayot from an early stage. It was put into a final form of sorts and edited together and completed around the year 400 CE. And the Mishnah was completed and published shortly after 200 CE. That means that the Yerushalmi developed over the course of a little less than 200 years. Now, there's been some debate about the exact end date for the Yerushalmi. We need not get involved deeply in the details of this debate, but there's a couple pieces of it that are informative and that are revealing in some interesting ways. One group argued for a later date, suggesting that it was completed more like in the 420s. They said that because there was a period of persecution around 429 that also resulted in the end of the office of Nasi, of the president of the Rabbinic Assembly. And they thought that those two were connected. The Talmud was written down to secure it when the community was threatened. This is based on assumptions that it turns out are completely wrong. Finalizing a text is as likely, or actually somewhat more likely, to be done in a moment of security when they have the luxury to attend to it rather than destruction, as we saw in the Mishnah. And second, the second argument for a later date was that would align it with the date of the latest named Amoraim in the Bavli. The Bavli continues to develop in the editorial layer for a while after that, but the latest main named quoted Amoraim lived through the 420s or 430s. But it turns out that what distinguishes those last two generations of Bavli Amoraim from those before them, and they've always been known as being of kind of their work being of a different tone. What distinguishes them is precisely that they appear to have known the Yerushalmi as a collection, which the previous Amoraim very clearly did not. Maimer of Rava and Abaye respond directly to Yerushalmi statements and discussions. Many Rav Papa Maimrot only make sense assuming that he knew whole Yerushalmi sugyot. The Yerushalmi clearly arrived in Bavel and was started to be studied intensively by the Babylonian Moraim from around 400 or slightly before and onward. Lastly, the Yerushalmi does not seem to have had anything like the kind of extended post-Amoraic editorial period that's so clear in the Bavli. While there's editing, it happened as the teachings were gathered and accreted. There was no moment or self-conscious act of finalizing, as there was for the Mishnah, and in a different way, the Bavli. There simply came a point after which nothing new was added. Right now. On the other hand, some scholars argued very vociferously for an earlier date, say 30 years earlier. One reason for this is that the last named Yerushalmi Moraim seem to have worked through about the 360s, and there isn't that entire layer of editorial material. But the bigger piece of evidence is that there's no mention of certain important events, contemporary events, that had they happened already, you would have expected them to be mentioned in the Yerushalmi. The biggest of those was the ascension of the Emperor Julian in 361 to become Emperor of Rome. He was known as Julian the Apostate. He desperately wanted to roll back the Emperor Constantine's decree converting the Roman Empire to Christianity. He wanted to undo all of it. Part of this was announcing a plan to allow the Jews to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This certainly would have been a major event, even a game changer for the rabbis. Yet it is not mentioned or alluded to anywhere in the Yerushalmi, suggesting, those scholars say, that it had basically reached final form already by 361. Sadly, this argument fails as well. The reason for this omission is not because it hadn't happened yet when the Yerushalmi was completed. The reason is that, in general, the Yerushalmi is commentary. This is something I said about the Mishnah, that we need to remember that the teachings taught in the Tannaitic period were commentary, meant to explain teachings that they received. What they talked about was determined by their source material, by what topics the Torah and the Midrash discussed in depth, and the key traditions of the Second Temple period. The Tanaim were focused on explaining and commenting. They were not focused on contemporary issues of their time. This is true even more so for the Yerushalmi, which is very much and limited to being a commentary on the Mishnah. It is not an attempt to connect or apply it to current events of their own time. As very clear evidence of this, it's not only the Emperor Julian who's passed over in silence. The original conversion of Constantine to Christianity in 312 CE, the Council of Nicaea in 325, which first gave Christianity real imperial backing. Also not mentioned. In fact, when you look at the Yerushalmi on Masechet Avodah Zarah about idolatry, you find that the Yerushalmi is only interested in explaining the pagan practices mentioned in the Mishnah. It does not in any way go through or catalog pagan or Christian practices of their own time. Okay, we're going to stop here and pick up in the second lecture.